Incorporating a built-in community mediator position into each institution provides a viable way to lend resources to a particular urban issue. It also works to alleviate some of the dominance of museums and cultural centers as discrete sites of formal cultural and artistic production, often framed in terms of how excluded groups may be recruited into existing practices. She recognized that this creates a conceptual framework that heritage practitioners must simply add the excluded and assimilate them into the fold rather than challenge underlying preconceptions. So next, collective approach, arte urbano and prácticas artísticas y comunidades. In 2002, during the transitional period in which gallery space declined in Quito, the Tranviacero Collective was founded with the twin aims of promoting art and community and sustaining social relations in public space. The collective has developed an urban network of collaborators within Quito, as well as in different cities, with an annual festival of urban art titled Al Zurich. In the 14 years since the collective was founded, they've been involved in projects and conferences in other major Ecuadorian cities such as Guayaquil and Cuenca, as well as in Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Spain. Their methodology emphasizes the necessity of understanding the context of a neighborhood and opening up a dialogue. Similar to mediación comunitaria, the recognition of internal conflict is integral to this approach. Pablo Ayala, a sculptor by training and a member of the collective, says that before considering himself an artist, he considers himself a creative. And another facet of his work is running a local cafe called Café Roscon, which also functions as a performance space. Ayala reflects on the approach that Tranviacero takes to working in the market, noting that San Roque is now becoming fashionable. And this is both positive and negative in the sense that many people are now doing projects with and about the market, which could risk making it an object of study. Examples of Tranviacero's projects with San Roque include a crafts workshop led by collective member Lenin Santa Cruz in partnership with the Santo Domingo Carpenters Association as a way to discuss the relationship between craft and memory, as well as jointly organized conferences on art and labor surrounding the market and San Roque neighborhood. Ayala advocates for starting with one or two individuals, building a relationship and respecting that the market is not a coherent site upon which to project resolutions. Keeping this balance is important, and I'll return to this. Pablo Ayala remarks that the approach of Tranviacero was not given much attention when the collective started working, but has recently people have taken more interest in this. Given this, he advocates for working within institutions only in order to challenge them. So moving on, Descultura is an independent and interdisciplinary nonprofit organization dedicated to research and cultural promotion in Quito. It was founded in 2007 with similar aims to those of Tranviacero, in declaring that social innovation in artistic practice is only possible if interventions start with a recognition of space and the diverse social and cultural processes that shape it. Working on a project with a group of neighbors in San Roque was a turning point for Paulo de la Vega, one of the directors of Descultura, who is also a PhD candidate in Latin American Cultural Studies at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar. The project actually began, as she explained to us, not with the community, but with a link to private promoters who were beginning to invest in San Roque. The investors solicited Descultura's help in beginning a social initiative that would avoid a negative impact. And so in this sense, Descultura was called to be this mediating force. The group of neighbors that they began working with were interested in countering the negative image about San Roque, and as many of them were small business owners whose work was not considered to be part of the heritage discourse, they organized themselves as guardians of their own heritage in San Roque, Asociación de Vecinos Guardianes de Patrimonio de San Roque. Part of the Guardians program was to organize alternative tours of the neighborhood for local people, calling them Caminos de San Roque. And de la Vega points out how this was a direct response to this heavy influence of tourism. However, she acknowledges that the funding provided by private enterprises was contested. It gave them the flexibility sometimes not supported through public funding. In response to criticisms leveled at this approach, de la Vega reflects on the importance of knowing how to negotiate with institutions, and the strategic necessity of taking funding from private sources. I recognize that this project is not about the market per se, as the others are, but I still felt that it was important to include. And so finally, an activist-led approach, as I'm calling it. Luis Herrera, as Danny mentioned, is one of the core members of Red de Saberes, the local activist network mobilized around the issues facing Macara San Roque in conjunction with the Frente de Defensa. He also has a documentary photography practice and has been involved in social struggles for territorial justice in Quito and throughout Ecuador, working with various communities as well as Sinead. He has been working in Macara San Roque for about 3 years, and previous to this, he also did work with Tranviacero. He began doing documentary photography in the market at the request of the Fundación de Museos, and worked on a project documenting the history of the 24 de Mayo, a main street in the historic center with a history of public occupation and political significance, including the previous location of the San Roque market vendors before it was moved to the current location. For Herrera, working as a photographer is always about working with and for an organization. He explained to Saskia and I that photography is a tool that mediates his relationship with the people he knows in the market. He pointed out that the representation and perception of the people working in the market is a political issue before it is a matter of aesthetics. The formation of Red de Saberes came out of this desire to recognize other forms of knowledge imbued in the market. And this is largely based on developing long-term relationships with people, building trust and accountability. Herrera points out that many people in the city are keen to do projects in the market, but they often aren't able to respond to the actual questions and concerns of those working there, and that exposure is not necessarily useful. Artistic practice, then, is a mediator that offers a particular forum through which to highlight political action. In the case of San Roque, for Herrera, this is a means to shift representation. The idea is to show that the market has another perspective, that it's not what the media says. The approach of Luis and Red de Saberes is closer to that of a social movement. Well, it is a social movement. It's also a long-term strategy. Herrera's documentary photography is not exhibited and sold to benefit the market. It forms a gesture of care and recognition that maintains this relationship. So artistic practice that relates to the concerns of the market in the shared recognition of socio-spatial conflict. And in this sense, they appear as allied struggles, not necessarily collapsed into one unified struggle, but recognizing the political and economic stakes that they are jointly antagonistic towards. So of course, no study would be complete without its discontents. Concerns about the role of the artist and the risk of appropriation were integral to the interviews and the research that I did. They are also central to North American-based criticism about socially engaged art. This convergence speaks to the broader discourse about what relationship art and politics do, should, or can have. Two primary discontents that emerged in this study were authorship and visibility. As Pablo Higuera points out, one critical aspect of social practice is this renunciation of the singular artist role and the authorial function that comes with it. Luis Herrera, in speaking on his documentary photography, makes explicit the fact that he is not interested in being considered the author of his photos, and instead understands the community of the market as entering into joint authorship with him. The neighborhood proposes and makes the project with the support of Tranviacero, says Pablo Ayala. The author is the neighborhood. This rejection of singular authorship emerged as a primary concern with identifying too closely with the title of artist. The lack of commercial art market is surely another reason for this. This enables this approach to become somewhat inoculated against a facile absorption of arts-based initiatives into urban development and heritage preservation. Negotiation with the field of representation is precisely the arena of dissident artistic practices, especially as these align with a particular social movement. In the case of Quito, when political struggle in the market must contend with the optics of that site in relation to those of the historic center, visibility becomes an even more significant issue. Knowing how to intervene and to what degree is of critical concern to practitioners interacting with Macara San Roque, especially as this site and its population are already vulnerable. In contrast to the hyper-visibility of the center and its monumentality and its spectacle, alternative ways of visibilizing the social and political struggles of the market are preferred. Practitioners must make choices about how and where to intervene. The UN Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage was adopted in 2003, and the definition of intangible heritage as offered in the convention describes it as the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. Yet, as Smith points out, all forms of heritage are inherently intangible and contested. distinguishing between heritage and intangible heritage obscures the value and meaning-based commonality. Again, this highlights the fundamental contradictory aspect of heritage discourse, as the appeal to universal agreement on heritage, intangible or not, ignores the existence of dispute. The Convention for Intangible Cultural Heritage, then, I suggest can be read as an attempt to reconfigure this understanding of heritage away from the dominance of the monumental and hypervisible. However, this approach still operates with reference to the authority of the existing discourse. Articles such as this one seen online at Luxury Travel Magazine invite visitors to experience the intangible heritage of Quito, Ecuador. So as interventions in the visual register, artistic community practice must acknowledge such risks as similar to their own. Representation and visibility are political issues. Heritage discourse and artistic practice both effectively manipulate the representational, visual, aesthetic realm, and therefore must be analyzed with respect to their relationship to political struggles. Invisibility and intangibility are 2 points on the spectrum for both dissident artistic practice in contested urban sites such as the market, and alternatives to monumental heritage such as in the center. So moving towards an alternative conceptual framework, I offer what little I can. Considering the language of the intangible cultural heritage and historic urban landscape approaches, that's another approach that I mentioned in my writing but didn't have time to get into here. So considering these and the manuals for practice in socially engaged art and in community practice put forward by Pablo Higuera, as well as the other Quito-based ones that I referred to, I submit the following propositions. These are meant to provide an alternative conceptual framework that is cognizant of capitalist land value theory, while also recognizing conflict as an integral part of heritage and community practice. This framework may be useful for urban practices that seek to ally subversive approaches to heritage sites with radical artistic and cultural strategies. This also acts as a call to further the criticality of heritage planning. So I suggest that the naming of Mercado San Roque as the anti-maravilla, anti-wonder of the city, it's meant to be a negative title. However, if the historic center is the authorized wonder and constitutes a commodified site isolated from the social reality of the city, then the market, being a space that is deliberately counter to this logic, is the anti-maravilla. Claiming this title may act as a counter to the inscription of dominant notions of cultural heritage and growth-led value. I also draw on the term counter-practice as Rosalind Deutsche used it in Evictions, referring to the radical potential of contemporary public art as a disruptive urban practice. She writes, "A counter-practice must, however, possess an adequate knowledge of the dominant construction within which it works. In the case of public art, but here I'm co-opting it for our purposes, it depends on a critical perception of the city's metamorphosis and of the role that public art is playing within it." So cognizant of the dominance of heritage discourse operating in the historic center, and critical of the potential for absorption into this discourse, arts-based community practice in Quito that valorizes the market acts as a counter-practice. So, limitations and considerations. Part of urban practice is acknowledging one's position and limitations. Although I'm actively learning Spanish, my research colleagues who speak fluently, particularly Saskia, as we conducted interviews together during the first research trip, helped to support my conversations. And while I have been able to utilize many texts by Spanish authors, I recognize that this would have benefited from more mastery with that language. Another limitation, is the range of practitioners that I had access to in Quito. I chose to focus on those who were deliberately coming to forge relationships with the market and how they engaged with that space. However, I understand that this is not reflective of the diversity of cultural and artistic forms practiced in the site. And a note, of course, on positionality and this kind of tense relationship between unitary theory and postmodern critical art theory. Locating oneself politically necessitates acknowledging the subject position one occupies with respect to society. Indeed, this is where the political action in art practice begins. This should not result in the diffusion of solidarity, but will strengthen it as practitioners confront their own ethical motivations and decide how and where to intervene based on this awareness. So concluding thoughts and moving forward, I hope you'll bear with me just a little bit longer. What bearing might this have for a reinvigorated sense of the avant-garde and artistic practice? I can hear you all groaning as I ask that. Should we even be asking this question? We can have the debate on that separately. Quito is not known as a major art hub within Latin America. This provides particular conditions for practice that may not be afforded to other centers, and consequently, this lack of a strong commercial market seems to, as I understand it, have had the effect of pushing practice towards political aims more so than in other centers. We can compare it to New York, maybe that's not fair, but where resistance to this art system is still the focal counterpoint for alternatives. Placing this site in conversation with recent critics and theorists from North America and Europe, it appears there's a strong desire for the characteristics that seem foundational to this practice. In the foreword to Raoul Zabecki's Territories in Resistance, journalist Don Paley writes, "Before Occupy Wall Street, there was La Victoria. La Victoria, as Paley explains, was a shack settlement in an undeveloped sector of Santiago de Chile that developed into a permanent neighborhood when families living in poverty created their own infrastructure and self-governance organizations." Paley acknowledges that there are major differences between Occupy and urban movements south of the US-Mexico border, but she identifies a compelling resonance between the hemispheres based on origins in crisis and rejection of the political and economic system. Social movements in Latin America have responded to pressures from both regional statecraft as well as in the north, and Paley considers what this transnational dialogue may produce, writing, "Maybe, as in the case of La Victoria, the experience of Occupy will inspire new community-level urban movements in North America to stage and defend public occupations, transforming the course of social struggle." Staged inside the Brooklyn Museum against the multitude of things, but primarily colonialism, gentrification, and other linked factors. And in August 2015, Spaces of Hope, a week-long series of workshops in the market hosted by the Frente de Defensa, the Ministry of Culture, and Sinead, took on a methodology that took its starting point from the critical stance of art, actually, and its relationship with society. It was a proposed laboratory for the testing, research, and discussion of ideas and strategies, deliberately conceived to embrace error and discord. And the development of an arts-based methodology indicates that confronting authorship critically also allows for the deconstruction of the notion of a stable or coherent community. The future of these movements, well, that's not a nice slide to end on, but anyway. The future of these movements remains contested, as does the role of artistic practice with respect to urban struggles. Recognizing the different but interlinked pressures facing urban social movements in Latin America is also relevant to identifying arts-based responses and sharing these approaches.